A trigger allows logic to be performed when certain conditions are met by checking if the trigger has been activated. You can see in the diagram that when the trigger isn't activated, the scene will transition to scene A. When the trigger is activated from the tap gesture, the scene will transition to scene B. In the box unit, we'll be implementing a trigger with time-based conditionals that will take our user to a different scene depending on when the trigger was set. We'll start out by adding a transition from our trans scene to our loop 01 scene. We'll go over to our loop 01 scene and drag a gesture area into the scene. We're going to name this gesture Trigger Start Button, and we'll add a tap to it. This gesture should transition from Trigger Loop 01 to Trigger Loop 02. In our Trigger Loop 02 scene, we'll add a gesture area and name this one Trigger Stop Button. We'll add a tap to this gesture, and then we'll add an action to set the trigger. We'll select New Trigger, and we'll give it a name. It's time to set up our trigger conditionals within the Trigger Loop 02 scene. So first, we'll create a default transition for if the trigger is never set at video end. This will send the user back to our Trigger Loop 01 scene. Now we'll create a transition that will send the user to our 20% scene. We'll click on the C to bring up conditionals, and we'll set the attributes to before 1 and after 0. We'll click the plus button next to trigger conditionals and set the trigger to trigger mode, which is the trigger we created earlier. What this means is that if the user sets the trigger after 0 seconds and before 1 second, it will send the user to the 20% result. We'll continue creating conditional transitions for each of the results as follows. We'll do a transition to a 40% result scene with attributes before 2 seconds and after 1 second, a transition to a 60% result scene with attributes before 3 seconds and after 2 seconds, a transition to an 80% result scene with attributes before 4 seconds and after 3 seconds, and finally a transition to a 100% result scene with attributes before 5 seconds and after 4 seconds. Each of these transitions should also have the same trigger conditional that we created earlier associated with them. Now we'll make sure that each of our result scenes transition back to the Trigger Loop 01 scene on video end. So now as our last step, we're going to add a transition from our return transition scene back to our home scene. Once we've completed setting up each of these transitions, we'll have completed a basic trigger setup. Let's take another look at how this unit performs.